With its immense natural resources, extensive coastline, and position facing the Arctic, Canada is arguably a country with immense strategic opportunities and some significant national strengths. But while the latter arguably includes everything from a well-educated workforce to a solid lock on the hockey romance export market, when it comes to security affairs, Canada isn't really known for being one of NATO's heavy hitters. The modern Canadian military has been described by its own defence minister as a force facing a recruitment death spiral. But just as great, or potentially an even greater challenge for the force, has been getting the troops that it does have the equipment they need, with military procurements sometimes proceeding at an almost glacial pace. This is, after all, a force that might end up spending 13 years to buy new light utility vehicles, and a country which cancelled its procurement of the F-35 and held a years-long competition to find a better, cheaper replacement, which was then won by the F-35. And when the military does get new equipment, don't expect it to come cheap. In South Korea, $1 billion might buy you a top-of-the-line destroyer. In Italy, you might have to settle for a multi-purpose frigate for that kind of money. But if you're a Canadian taxpayer, a total project budget of just over $1 billion might be enough to get you this. And so today, by popular request, it's time to talk Canada. To do that, we'll start with the basics: Canada's military history, strategic position, and stated objectives. Then we'll pivot to looking at the Canadian military, some of its strengths and more of its weaknesses, and ask what might be driving some of the issues here, considering that, on paper, Canada is arguably a country with all of the fundamental resources necessary to be a much more significant military power than it is. Now, to keep things tight, I'll be focusing on a fraction of the procurement disasters I could potentially cover, mostly looking at shipbuilding rather than the Air Force or the Army. We might save some of those other disasters and a deep dive into the procurement system for a potential follow-up episode. I'll also be spending a lot more time today focusing on Canadian challenges rather than areas of comparative strength. And now, before we jump into this very Canadian story, let me welcome back a sponsor. In the context of a modern information environment that often absolutely saturates you with stories and information, sometimes you might want to have a tool to potentially help you get a fuller picture and more balanced perspective. To that end, Ground uses a website and app that gathers related articles from more than 50,000 sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same stories. For example, if you look at coverage of the news Russia may be increasing its defence spending by about 25% in 2025, you can click through and see what different sources are choosing to elevate to their headline. This Russian state media article, for example, only gives the rough dollar value of the draft national defence budget, $148.5 billion, but it's other headlines that might flag the scale of an increase that this represents, or mention the war in Ukraine as a critical driver. And as you click through, you'll also be able to see other potentially relevant context, like information on media ownership, as well as assessments of media factuality and political lean by 3 independent news monitoring organisations. There are also other interesting features that might be worth unpacking. I constantly flag the blind spot feed. What this can do is try to surface stories that are being disproportionately covered by sources from one point or another on the political spectrum. And an obvious use case there is it might give you more visibility over stories that are unlikely to be covered by sources you might ordinarily consume. I've said in the past that I don't think there's any single solution to problems like echo chambers or distorted reporting. But there's still problems worth confronting, and Ground News might help. So if you are interested, you can go to ground.news/Perun or use the link in the description. That'll get you access to a 40% discount on a Vantage plan, which gets you unlimited access to all of Ground News features. And so with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. So I'll start, as I often do, with a bit of history, but to keep the video a manageable length, I'm mostly going to use this section to demonstrate one point. And that's that whatever we say or think about the Canadian military now, for much of its history as a unified country, and even before that, Canada has often been punching well above its weight class in military terms. Canadian militia and units would arguably perform effectively against the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, but the real demonstration of this phenomenon, I think, came in the 20th century with the First and Second World Wars. In both cases, Canada jumped into the fray and became a vital part of the wider Allied war efforts. During the First World War, the Canadian Expeditionary Forces would raise 600,000 men from a pre-war population of 8 million. 400,000 of those would serve overseas, and Canadian units were often highly decorated. By the start of the Second World War, the Canadian population had increased to around 11 million. What else are you going to do during the winter months, I guess? And the mobilisation rate increased alongside the population. Roughly 1.1 million Canadians would serve, about 10% of the population, and while they don't tend to get as much Hollywood screen time, Canadian units were absolutely essential in some of the war's most decisive campaigns. There were 5 Allied landing beaches during the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord for example, and film producers have perhaps understandably focused on the 2 American ones, Omaha and Utah. But arguably one of the most successful landings was at Juno Beach by the Canadian 3rd Infantry, 2nd Armoured, and elements of the British Royal Marine Commandos. In both wars, Canada would make arguably outsized contributions in a range of specialised fields, whether that be fighting the U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic, or consistently the war in the air. During World War I, for example, 3 of the top 10 credited aces of the conflict were Canadian: Bishop with 72 aircraft shot down, Collishaw with 60, and McLaren with 54. A 4th managed to come in at 12th with 50 shot down. It's also worth noting that unlike many other aces, including the top-scoring Richthofen from Germany, all of those Canadians would survive the war. The quality of Canadian air training efforts was also often matched with quantity. During the Second World War, through the Commonwealth Air Training Plan, 167,000 students would train in Canada, including 50,000 pilots. More than half of the total graduates from that program would be Canadians themselves. And when we start talking about Canada's modern procurement and production experience a little bit later on, I want you to keep in mind the scale of what was achieved in the 40s. Canadian aircraft production levels during World War II reached 4,000 per year and 16,000 for the total war. They built nearly 350 10,000-tonne merchant ships, roughly one every 6 days, various destroyers and combat vessels, 800,000 military vehicles of various types, including 2,150 self-propelled guns, 40,000 field, naval and anti-aircraft guns, 1.7 million small arms, meaning they didn't just produce enough guns for every soldier in the Canadian Army, they produced enough for them to dual-wield if they wanted to, plus they cranked out a variety of other military equipment from tanks to snowmobiles. But some parts of the Canadian contribution were a bit more niche and perhaps difficult for the Allied effort to do without. Canada's aluminium facilities around the city of Saguenay reportedly accounted for about 40% of overall Allied supply. By the time demobilisation began, Canada had a large, powerful military and then a navy that was in the top 4 globally. That force would rapidly be reduced, but it had been a titanic effort by a country that started the war with a smaller population than modern Los Angeles. Canadian defence policy would continue to evolve throughout the Cold War. The nation was particularly concerned with topics like air and missile defence, leading to the foundation of NORAD with the United States, and also the challenge of Soviet naval power and naval aviation. By Canadian assessments in the 1980s, the Soviets had something like 155 submarines in the Northern Fleet alone. And if you look at the map on the right there, you'll see areas marked in blue, where some Allied forces operating against those kind of Soviet threats would have been under Canadian command. But the Canadian Army and parts of the Canadian Air Force during the Cold War were primarily committed to the NATO deterrence mission in Europe. As a Canadian government document from the time put it, much of Canada's defence effort is focused on Europe. That is where the conventional threat is concentrated and, in war, where the decisive conventional battle will be fought. By contributing to deterrence in Europe, Canadian forces are serving Canadian interests and contributing to Canada's security. But at this point, you're probably waiting for the inevitable axe to drop. So many of the nations we've looked at experienced massive cuts in defence funding following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then over the decades of peace dividend that followed would see their military capabilities atrophy. Canada's story, though, isn't one of massive defence cuts starting in 1991, partly because by the time other countries started their cuts, Canada was about 3 decades into theirs. According to the Canadian government, in the early 1960s the country was spending about 3.5% of GDP on national defence. But by 1970 the number was trending towards 2%, and by 1974 it was below it. The following is a quote from Canada's defence strategy in 1987, at a time when the Cold War was very much still on. Quote, "Underfunding inevitably took its toll on the equipment used by the Canadian Armed Forces. Purchases were deferred or spread over a longer period of time. It became normal to replace equipment on a less than one-for-one basis and to reduce modernisation programs, even though there might be no military logic for doing so." End quote. Essentially, Canada cutting back on national defence spending is about as new as colour TV. But before we get too far into that, let's zoom back out for a moment and just have a look at Canada's main resources and threats, its strategic position and objectives. At a very high level, Canada is a relatively wealthy, well-developed country at the northern edge of the North American continent. The country has a population of around 40 million, a GDP of around $2.1 trillion equivalent, which by some measures makes it around the 10th largest economy in the world. GDP per capita is estimated at around $53,000 per annum, and the country has a relatively low Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality. The country's economy is supported not just by a relatively well-developed service and high-technology sector, but also by immense resource wealth. According to the Canadian government, about 20% of the country's GDP is tied to the resource sector, with energy being the most important, and the United States being the primary buyer. Unlike many of the countries we've looked at, including Japan, Korea and Russia, Canada also still has a growing population. with the country compensating for natural ageing with strong net immigration flows. That's helped support the workforce and wider economy, although good luck buying a house in Vancouver. In short, when combined with a strategic environment that consists of a friendly superpower to the south and oceans to the north, east and west, if this was a strategy game, Canada wouldn't just be an easy mode start, it'd be a decent candidate for the tutorial mission. Long on resources, economic development and a well-trained workforce, and very short on proximate security threats. That said, even though Canada doesn't get the Finland or South Korea style experience of directly having a land border with a potential invading power, that doesn't mean its strategic geography doesn't create areas of intense strategic interest and potential competition. Most of the time, you're probably used to looking at a world map that's laid out something like the one on the right there. And if you read up on the history of the Cold War, the NATO-Warsaw Pact confrontation might look a little bit like that. That said, we do live on a globe, controversial statement I know, and so if you look at Canadian strategic documents, often they won't draw you a world map that looks like that. They'll instead draw you one that looks like this, showing that Canada and Russia aren't quite so far apart as a traditional projection might suggest. For Canada, many of the country's strategic interests and potential threats come not from the east or the west, but from the north. Like many of the other countries we've looked at, not named Iran or North Korea, Canada does have some public-facing defence strategy documents. A revised version of the document on the right there, Our North Strong and Free, came out this year, and it sets out at a high level how Canada views the evolving global security environment and what it wants to get out of its military, or at least what they're willing to tell us, so I wouldn't entirely rule out the Canadians teaming up with the Poms to make a second shot at the White House just because it doesn't appear in this document. In any case, the strategy sets out a number of publicly acknowledged objectives, including defending North America, which includes an ongoing commitment to the North American Aerospace Defence Command, or NORAD. This is a joint Canadian-US organisation, stood up in the late 1950s, and it has a collective aerospace warning and defence function for both Canada and the continental United States. They also publicly track Santa Claus every December and have a Game of Thrones-worthy motto, "We have the watch." The strategy also gives pride of place to what it calls advancing Canada's interests and values. In practice, that sort of heading can encompass a range of military commitments and operations, but there are two from a historical perspective that stand out. The first is peacekeeping. Canada put its hand up for every United Nations peacekeeping effort from the organisation's foundation up until 1989. Whether that was a result of Canadians just trying to be good and friendly global citizens, or part of a massive long con to lull us all into a false sense of security, is a mystery I'll have to leave to the audience, but the list of deployments was extensive. During the Cold War, Canadian peacekeepers went to Egypt, Lebanon, Congo, New Guinea, Yemen, the Dominican Republic, India, Pakistan, Egypt again, Lebanon, and the list goes on. Since the end of the Cold War, the country has continued to be active in international peacekeeping, either through the United Nations or other multinational missions. The other side of this is trying to contribute to the wider alliances like NATO that really, at the end of the day, underpin Canada's security strategy. Friendliness may just be a core component of the Canadian national character, but it's also probably pretty core to their survival strategy, which arguably partly comes down to threatening to call Uncle Sam, or London if that line happens to be engaged for some reason, if they ever need to borrow a nuclear umbrella because someone's getting a little too aggro. Obviously, alliances and the deterrence they create are meant to be collective activities, so you can get images like the one on the right there of Canadian Leopard 1s patrolling in Germany back in the 1980s. As one Canadian strategy from the 80s put it, deterrence is not divisible. If it fails in Europe, it fails everywhere. And by contributing to deterrence in Europe, Canadian forces are serving Canadian interests and contributing to Canada's security. Now, in 2024, Canada's security commitments to Europe look very different than they did back in 1986. But their strategy documents still call out the importance of these alliance structures and Canada's commitment to them. But perhaps the most important objective in the view of the document is the defence of Canada and its people. A lot of the stated objective here sits under titles like asserting Canadian sovereignty, saying that the government would be guided by the overall objective of ensuring the military had the people, equipment, training and infrastructure needed to detect, deter and defeat threats in, over and approaching Canada. Geographically, it put particular focus on defending the Arctic and the North in its approaches against new and accelerating threats through credible deterrence. And we've talked in the past about just how important the Arctic and far north is from a Canadian strategic perspective, especially as sea ice levels continue to fall, and the so-called Northwest Passage, which we've discussed before, becomes potentially more strategically significant. In the Arctic, though, Canada arguably faces some pretty significant strategic competition. The Canadians very much feel that, and they say as much in their 2024 document. Quote, "Our Arctic is warming at 4 times the global average, opening the region to the world, which was previously protected by the polar ice cap year-round. By 2050, the Arctic Ocean could become the most efficient shipping route between Europe and East Asia. We are seeing greater Russian activity in our air approaches, and a growing number of Chinese vessels and surveillance platforms are mapping and collecting data about the region. Meanwhile, states are rapidly building up their military capabilities in ways that impact our security in the Arctic, including submarines, long-range aircraft, and hypersonic missiles that move faster and are harder to detect. As the Arctic becomes more accessible to foreign actors, we need to ensure our military has the tools to assert our sovereignty and protect Canada's interests." The obvious kicker there, though, is that compared to a nation like Russia, Canada has far fewer bases and far fewer military assets capable of projecting power into the Arctic. In that sense, at least, the invasion of Ukraine might represent a kind of short strategic reprieve from the Canadian perspective, as we've seen Russia consume a lot of specialised Arctic warfare personnel and equipment in Ukraine and divert resources away from things like next-generation icebreakers to support more immediate military needs. But as I noted in my video on Arctic competition, even when you're talking about purely civilian Arctic-relevant assets, Canada's ability to compete with countries like Russia in terms of Arctic access and asserting sovereignty is probably very much going to be an alliance-dependent exercise for the foreseeable future. And frankly, from a protecting sovereignty perspective, asking the Americans and friends for assistance with this one may not be a perfect answer, considering that one of the most significant, public and long-standing objections to Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage comes from the United States. One imagines it might be a tad awkward asking the US to enforce Canadian sovereignty against the US. Essentially, alliances might be useful here, but there are probably some pretty strong imperatives for Canada to have some of its own sovereign capabilities as well. A final element of Canada's defence strategy worth highlighting is the focus on the role of the Canadian Defence Industrial Base. In terms of its scale and capabilities, I'd argue the Canadian Defence Industrial Base is in a bit of an awkward spot. Accounting for, according to Canadian government estimates, about 78,000 jobs across the country and about $12.6 billion in GDP, it's large enough and advanced enough to be capable of producing some very high-quality products. And billions of US dollars worth of those products find success on the international arms market. Perhaps the most high-profile example here is the LAV-6 infantry fighting vehicle, derived originally from the Swiss Piranha, which scored a roughly $11 billion US export success when more than 900 of the vehicles were sold to Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, though, at that sort of scale in a high-cost economy, it's hard to be good at everything. And with the Canadian defence industry as a whole being considerably smaller even than those of the United Kingdom, France or Germany, the available options are probably either industrial specialisation or very high costs. They don't have the labour cost advantage of Korea or some of the Eastern and Southern European producers, nor do they have the insane scale of some of the US firms. And that might go some small way towards explaining some of the things we're going to talk about a little later in this episode. In summary, Canada's goals include defending Canadian sovereignty, territory and interests, meeting its alliance obligations and helping to defend North America, advancing its values and interests, and, to quote the Canadian Defence Minister, maintain a reliable, persistent military presence to uphold the global rules that underpin our prosperity and sovereignty. So that's Canada's strategic geography, challenges and stated objectives. Let's start looking at the military they have to try and achieve those goals. Canada's army is the largest of its service arms by personnel count, but with 22,000 active personnel and 24,000 reservists, you could still fit the entire active and reserve establishment into the grandstands of a particularly large sports ground. In terms of equipment, in some categories the Canadian Army does have a decent amount of kit for its size, including more than 550 LAV-6 infantry fighting vehicles and hundreds more light armoured vehicles of various types. In other areas, the force is a bit lighter on. The tank force consists of 74 main battle tanks, 34 of which are only really for training, and options for longer range ground-based fires basically centre on 33 towed 155mm guns. As of Military Balance 2024, the Royal Canadian Navy has about 8,400 active personnel, operating vessels including 4 diesel-electric submarines and 12 frigates of the Halifax class. There are also a number of vessels in Canadian inventory intended for lower risk environments or for support roles, like mine countermeasure ships and the Arctic offshore patrol ships that we'll come back to later. There's no real amphibious assault ships or helicopter carriers, certainly no aircraft carriers, and when it comes to the actual armaments of a lot of the ships the Canadians do currently have in inventory, most tend to be much more towards the German as opposed to Russian or Korean side of the spectrum. Canada's main combat vessels, the Halifax-class frigates, do not have VLS cells. Instead, they have to make do with 8 subsonic Harpoon missiles for surface targets, and 16 Evolved Sea Sparrows to cover off air and missile defence. Meanwhile, if you look at the 12 much smaller Kingston-class coastal defence vessels, those are probably limited in terms of what they could defend the coast against, using a grand total of 0 missiles, 1 40mm cannon and 2 50-calibre machine guns. To be fair, of course, the Canadian military does appear to have recognised that the armament package on the Kingston may not be appropriate for modern conditions, so they decided to change it up in 2014 by removing the 40mm gun and leaving the ships with only 2 50 cals. After being removed, many of the World War II era 40mm guns were repurposed to serve as monuments. The Canadians do have a plan to replace the old underarmed Halifax-class frigates with the new River-class destroyers starting in the 2030s, a class which involves starting with the proven British Type 26 frigate design and then managing to make it more expensive while cutting 2/3 of the VLS cells. The original UK Type 26 had 24 of the larger Mark 41 VLS cells to carry larger missiles like Tomahawks or anti-ship weapons, and then 48 smaller cells for Sea Sceptre surface-to-air missiles. The Canadian design deleted those 48 cells and moved the larger air defence missiles back into the Mark 41. This was then meant to be partially compensated for by adding 8 anti-ship missiles and 2 quad-box launchers. I'll also note that the Australians with their version of the ship, the Hunter class, did something similar to the Canadians by adding the 8 box launchers, but they also increased the number of those large Mark 41 cells from 24 to 32. If you cut it in that way, the Canadian ship certainly seems to have an interesting missile count to cost ratio. In terms of personnel count, the Royal Canadian Air Force is in between the Army and the Navy, with about 12,000 active personnel. Canada's primary air combat asset are its nearly 90 CF-18 Hornets, although they also have north of 40 transport aircraft and 14 P-3 anti-submarine warfare aircraft. Then, given the nature of Canada's position and threats, I think the Coast Guard also deserves a special mention. This is nearly 6,000 active duty personnel, operating about 79 patrol and coastal combatants of various kinds, although military balance classifies more than 60 of those as falling in the patrol boat category. This is where you'll find a lot of Canada's vitally important ice-breaking platforms, as well as vessels filling a range of functions, including customs enforcement and counter-narcotics. Which brings us, at last, to some of the problems. Because remember, as I said right at the start, if these things were just based on the size of Canada's economy, its demography, the skills of its workforce, etc., you would expect it to have a fairly respectable middle power force. In reality, though, just like the German Bundeswehr, for example, there are some elements that really hold the potential of the force back compared to some comparators. For one, while equipment clearly isn't everything, fistfights also don't tend to win modern wars. And across multiple equipment categories, the Canadian equipment inventory just isn't that large compared to some of their NATO peers. As the chart on screen shows, Canada isn't doing terribly when it comes to a lot of armoured vehicle types compared to Germany, Poland, Italy, France or the United Kingdom, especially when it comes to infantry fighting vehicles, for example, where Canada's inventory of domestically built LAVs pushes it ahead of Italy and the United Kingdom. But even if you ignore the more land-focused Polish army entirely, as well as France's long-running procurement love affair with the VAB APC, the Canadian inventory levels aren't exactly going to win many prizes here. More dramatic, though, is the situation with mobile artillery. Every other country we're looking at here has between 50 and 400 self-propelled guns in service. Canada has 0. Each of the other countries also has multiple rocket launchers. Canada has 0. That'd probably be fairly unfortunate for the Canadian Army if either of those systems categories had proven themselves at all useful in Ukraine. Now, of course, the Canadians do have an inventory of more than 150 towed howitzers, but only a bit over 30 of them are 155mm pieces, all M777s. But hey, you might be thinking, that might be because the Canadian Army wants to focus more on mobility, so maybe they're investing it in attack helicopters or something. Only to look at the chart and see, nope, Canada doesn't have any of those either. And trust me, it should be considered an act of mercy that I haven't included some other categories here as well. The larger and vehicle-mounted air defence category, for example, would also have Canada basically drawing a blank. Now, of course, Canada does have an air force, but its inventory of combat aircraft that fit into that fighter, multi-purpose or attack category doesn't exactly blow away its NATO peers. With Italy, France and the United Kingdom all having fleets at least 50% larger than the Canadian one, and the German force being more than twice as large. Finally, that brings us to the Royal Canadian Navy, which you might expect to be the most powerful and most prioritised of the services, given Canada's long coastline and dependence on maritime trade. In simple hull count, though, I'm not really seeing it. The principal surface combatant fleet is about the same size as the German one, smaller than Italy, France or the United Kingdom, The Patrol and Coastal Combatant Force is comparatively tiny, in part because the Canadian Coast Guard runs a lot of the smaller vessels, and the critically important submarine force, which you might expect to be a priority for a maritime power, is comparatively tiny, with Canada operating 4 submarines to the British 10, French 9, and Italian 8. And while we could absolutely play around with categories or definitions here, overall in putting together these charts, a lot of the assumptions and fudges I've made function to make Canada look better, not worse. For example, we are completely ignoring the fact that France and the United Kingdom managed to fit nuclear weapons into their budget, systems which I'd suggest might have at least some degree of strategic significance. We're also ignoring that the French and British attack submarines aren't the comparatively cheaper conventional electric boats, but rather nuclear-powered predators that can go hunting basically anywhere they want on the world's oceans. We're also ignoring the special role of carriers and ignoring carrier air groups, which works perfectly well for Canada, which doesn't have carriers, but means that the counts for France and Italy miss out on some Rafales and F-35s respectively. Leaving out the Marines cut the collective armoured vehicle counts for the French, British and Italians by hundreds of vehicles in total, and while yes, including Coast Guards might have pumped the Canadian ship numbers up a bit, I can't imagine the blokes on the right there doing particularly well if they had to deter a Russian Arctic incursion. The core point is that for reasons we'll get into a little bit later on, comparatively speaking, the Canadian military just doesn't have that much stuff. And that brings us to problem 2. A lot of what it does have is very, very old. And to keep things moving, I'll focus on just a few short examples. The backbone of the Royal Canadian Air Force is the CF-18, the Canadian version of the American FA-18. The first CF-18 entered Canadian service in 1982, and the newest airframe to roll off a production line did so in 1988. That means the oldest airframes out there have pushed into their 30s at this point, and through the Hornet Extension program, Canada hopes to keep some of these aircraft flying into the 2030s. As an additional twist, in the late 2010s, once it became clear the Canadians wouldn't be able to rapidly replace the Hornet with a new aircraft that would eventually turn out to be the F-35, long story, we might go there some other time, it was determined the Canadian Air Force needed some sort of interim acquisition in order to maintain its combat strength, given the age and limited number of the Hornets, until the new aircraft could arrive. The solution they settled on to the problem of having a bunch of ageing Hornets from the 1980s was to buy even more ageing Hornets from the 1980s from the Royal Australian Air Force. Some of these would be upgraded and later flown, while others would be parted out to help keep the fleet going. That may have done great things for spare parts and aircraft availability, but didn't exactly do much for the average age of the airframes. Moving on, all 4 of the Royal Canadian Navy submarines belong to the roughly 2,500-tonne displacement Victoria class. The first of the boats was commissioned into Canadian service back in 2000, but it wasn't commissioned new. The Canadian Victoria class of the 2000s had originally been built as the UK Upholder class of the 1980s. They first entered Royal Navy service in 1990 before the Poms pretty quickly decided that with the Soviet Union suffering critical existence failure, they didn't want them anymore, and after a failed attempt to shop the things off to Pakistan, Canada apparently put their hand up and said, that's what we want. In July of this year, the Canadian government announced the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, or CPSP, to finally replace the Victorias with 12 new conventionally powered submarines. But with some reports suggesting the new boats are unlikely to make it into service until 2037, the oldest of the Victorias may be getting close to half a century since their first commissioning by the time they're finally replaced. Moving on to transport helicopters, barring a very small fleet of Chinooks, Canada is reliant on the CH-146 Griffin, a utility helicopter that can track its development vintage back to the Hueys of the Vietnam era. Canada reportedly ordered 100 of these things on a sole source contract back in the early 1990s, with the fleet being manufactured between 92 and 97. The stated goal when the Griffins were procured was that they would replace 4 other helicopters in Canadian inventory, ranging from the CH-136 Scout and Observation helicopter to the CH-147 Chinook. As you might expect, though, that meant the Griffin was arguably very much a creature of compromise. Much larger than the reconnaissance helicopters it replaced in the reconnaissance role, and far, far underpowered compared to things like the Chinook or even the American Black Hawk. That might partly explain why, after having gotten rid of its Chinooks, Canada would go on to buy some new Chinooks. But the bulk of the military helicopter fleet would remain the Griffin. The original intention appears to have been to retire the Griffins in the early 2020s, after about 30 years of service. But the Canadian government only announced plans to spend roughly 18 billion Canadian dollars replacing the Griffin in 2024. And the fleet's been going through modernisation and life extension work to keep them flying into the 2030s. And if you thought the Canadian Army might escape the ageing equipment problem just because a lot of its stuff is cheaper and easier to procure than things like fighter jets, submarines or helicopters, yeah, I'm sorry, but this ain't that kind of movie. As we noted earlier, Canada has about 160 towed howitzers in inventory, of which 33 are the M777 155mm guns. But about 100 of those 160 pieces are the thing you see on the right here, the C3 close support gun. If you go to the Canadian Army's website and click on the tab for equipment, you'll be told that, quote, from the Leopard 2A4 tank to the M777 howitzer, the Canadian Army is equipped with the latest in modern military equipment, end quote. You will then be given a list of small arms, armoured vehicles, artillery systems, etc., but the C3 won't appear on the list. Perhaps for the best, given this is essentially a modernised Canadian-built version of the American M101 howitzer from the Second World War, now mostly used for training purposes and apparently to support Parks Canada in clearing avalanches. To which I'll just add that firing World War II artillery at avalanches sounds to me like a pretty bloody cool job, and one you could probably sell as a tourist experience. Given that snow and mountains are not known for their tendency to shoot back, I'm sure the C3 performs perfectly well in that role. But if you're trying to count how many battlefield-capable guns the Canadians have, you really wouldn't want to give a system like this a passing mark. And having a bunch of relatively old equipment in service might go some way towards explaining identified issue number 3, low readiness rates and deployability. Reportedly, on average, at any given time, only about 45% of the Royal Canadian Air Force fleet is operational, along with 46% of the Navy's capacity and 54% of the Army's. If you want some comparisons there for baselining purposes, in 2023, the US Air Force reported mission readiness rates above 90% for its C-37s, 85% for its new F-15EXs, between 65 and 69% for its F-16s, while even the maintenance-intensive stealth aircraft, the F-35, the F-22 and the B-2 Spirit, all clocked in rates above 50%, and that collectively was considered a bad year and a decrease on 2022 levels. Now, a force might be able to deal with low inventory levels, it might be able to work around low readiness rates, but stick them together and you might get statements like the following, quote, this means that even Canada's minor military projection ambition, which consists of only 3 frigates, 2 fighter jet squadrons and 1 mechanised brigade, is not assured. Whether or not those exact numbers hold, the picture they paint seems to be fairly stark. And in turn, it probably begs the question, why is it like this? And while I can't possibly answer that question in full today, I do want to look at least 3 drivers, 3 horsemen, or reindeer if you like, of Canada's defence woes. Okay, so let's start with Reindeer 1, the most obvious issue and one that gets talked about most openly and most often, and that's that the Canadian defence budget itself just isn't that big. I once heard someone tell me that if you made a bingo card out of every element of budgetary policy that could cause pain to a defence establishment, Canada's defence spending policies probably would have cleared the board at this point. It arguably features some classics that we might get into, like decisions that are politically rather than militarily optimised, programs that are funded to start up and then cancelled before they can deliver the expected benefit, short-termism and offer a major mismatch between means and objectives. But to start with perhaps the most basic and obvious issue, Canada has long spent less than the NATO 2% target of defence, which the country did sign up to, and while many countries in the past have failed to meet that target, there are very few major economies in the alliance that can claim to have undershot the target so significantly and so consistently. What you can see on screen here is a chart showing defence spending as a percentage of real GDP for a couple of selected nations between 2014 and 2024. This is coming from a NATO spending dataset. For the comparators here, you have Canada in the red, France in the blue, the UK in grey, and Poland in white, with that orange bar being the 2% marker. It shows that over the last decade, the UK has consistently hit the target. The Poles missed the mark a couple of times, 2014 and 2017, but they've been spending well above 2% since 2020 and hit 4% in 2024. The French only actually hit the target market twice, but they were always at least relatively close. While Canada phoned it in with a mighty 1% in 2014, and then failed to hit 1.5% in any of the covered years, including after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Put another way, even in its best year, in inverted commas, Canadian defence spending as a share of GDP never caught France during their worst year. And just in case anyone thinks I'm cherry-picking the comparator nations, here's how every member of the alliance looked on the same chart in 2024. Now, on the right-hand side, well exceeding the 2% target, you have a mixture of countries that nervously have to exist near Russia: Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, along with another country with neighbour issues, Greece, as well as the United States, which is in the business of global power projection. Overall, the vast majority of countries in the alliance are now hitting that 2% target, leaving Canada by this measure, fifth from the bottom, ahead only of renowned military superpowers like Belgium, Luxembourg, Slovenia and Spain. That chart very clearly shows a potential pain point, but arguably misses two related ones. The first is the way that underspending can compound. If you never replace older equipment, it's going to become more and more expensive to maintain over time, leaving you less and less money in your budget to replace it with new equipment. And even worse than that, it can have a flow-on to your supply chain, your production lines, your defence workforce, etc. You skip out on replacement, so your upkeep costs steadily go up, while your production lines get ever colder. That means potentially with every year that passes, you'll have less money available because maintenance costs are going up, but the cost of replacement is going to go up too, which tempts you to further either delay or downscale your replacement efforts, which just pushes the death spiral ever further. The other historical issue, which is far from unique to Canada, has often been budgetary uncertainty. Fixing anything in the defence industry or force design often requires consistency and commitment. But if you're never sure as a decision maker whether next year's budget is going to continue to climb, or whether old habits will return and you'll be asked to make sudden, difficult cuts, you might have to do all sorts of expensive and inefficient things to try and get the maximum possible benefit with the resources you have right that second, instead of taking an optimised approach that may get defunded halfway through. However you cut it, the Canadian military has consistently been told to solve its problems, with a budget that, as a share of GDP, is well below NATO standards. But speaking of compounding issues, we now need to add reindeer 2 of the procurement apocalypse. If problem 1 is how big the budget is, problem 2 is how much of that budget actually gets spent on new stuff. Now yes, defence budgets are complicated, there are a lot of variations between countries, and a lot of categorisations can be contested. But NATO releases official expenditure data, which for each country divides that defence budget into 4 categories: equipment, personnel, infrastructure, and other, which enables us to make at least a semi-like-for-like comparison across the alliance. The reason this matters is you could have a country with a comparatively small defence budget that still has significant buying and investment power because it focuses that spending on buying new kit. So you might be asking, does Canada manage to compensate for its lower budget by cutting back on all the non-essentials and remaining razor-focused on acquiring the equipment that warfighters need and avoiding a maintenance death spiral? Yeah, nah, in every year except for 2024 out of the last 10, less than 15% of the Canadian defence budget went to purchasing new equipment, and in the very least 2015, 16, 17 and 22, the number was closer to 10% than it was to 15. If you want to get a sense of scale there against our various NATO comparison nations, you have that on screen now. Over the last 5 years, the magic number for France and the United Kingdom was consistently between 25 and 35%. The UK even jumped over that a little bit in 2024. Italy spent 4 of those 5 years above the 20% marker, and Poland started close to the 30% mark in 2020 and made it to 50% in 2024. Meaning that even with a much, much smaller budget than comparatively wealthier Canada, the gap between what the Poles and the Canadians had to spend in US dollar terms on new kit was nowhere near as wide as you might think. If you cut the data another way and create a top 3 list of the nations in NATO that have spent the lowest percentages of their budget on new equipment over the last 5 years, most of the time a country's presence in the ranking is going to be fairly bumpy because procurements tend to be bumpy. The Netherlands came second in lowest spending percentage in 2022, for example, but their spending percentage had actually been in the top third of the list in 2021 and was in the middle third in 2023. Denmark would top the list once in 2023, but otherwise would consistently be middle of the pack. Plus, it would also be a major spender on new military equipment, not for its own military, but for Ukraine. The Canadians, meanwhile, presumably thinking consistency was king, would manage to podium 4 out of the 5 years, taking silver in 2021, 2023 and 2024, and managing a well-deserved gold in the NATO Underinvestment Cup in 2022. So, next question, if the money isn't being spent on new kit, where is it actually going? If you look at the other options, your first guess might be infrastructure. Canada has a lot of interests in the Arctic, and you'd expect projecting power or setting up new infrastructure there to be a tad more complicated than if you were doing it on, say, Salisbury Plain. But compared to, say, Russia, Canada is actually massively under-provisioned when it comes to Arctic-facing bases and infrastructure. That's part of the strategic challenge it faces. According to our NATO data, in recent years, the infrastructure category's only been consuming about 3% of Canadian defence spending. Spending on the other category, however, has tended to hover around 10 times that. Almost by definition, this is the most complicated and difficult of the 4 categories to pass. NATO gives a couple of examples of what might fit under this category, including operations and maintenance and research and development. And that's fair, operations are expensive and equipment needs to be maintained, but it's interesting to look at the way the Canadians compare here to some of those other nations we're looking at. Comparing Canada against the UK, France, Italy and Poland across the last 10 years, Canada spent more on this category in percentage of budget terms than every country except for the United Kingdom between 2014 and 2021, and then actually overtook the UK to top the charts in 2022, 2023 and 2024. The gap in several cases was not small. And if you're looking at this with operations, maintenance, research and development in mind, you're probably going to have questions. A lot of those countries proportionally have more equipment to maintain than Canada does. And especially if you're talking about the UK and France, they can have some very high-tech, expensive, next-generation development programs going as well. Think everything from submarines to 6th-generation fighters. While Canada comparatively buys in more of its equipment. Both the UK and France also tend to engage in a reasonable amount of operational power projection. Think French operations in Africa, or the Brits sending an aircraft carrier as far afield as the Pacific. So it's not like they have it easy on operations costs when compared to the Canadians. And it would arguably be almost impressive if Canada was able to spend so much on maintenance that it topped this category despite not having those overseas entanglements or next-generation research programs in the same way, and yet still apparently managed to have about half their shit out of service at any given time, as we discussed earlier. Turns out there's probably a lot more in this category to unpack if we want it to make any degree of sense, but for reasons of time, we might save that thread for the future. But those of you following along with the math at home have probably already figured out that it must be the final category, personnel costs, that make up a plurality of Canadian defence expenditure. Let's be clear, personnel costs are extremely important and can be a very good thing. You want to pay people well, you want to provide them good conditions, you want to attract talented people into the armed forces, and having the best aircraft in the world, for example, isn't going to help you if you don't have people to fly or maintain them. But from a cold budgetary math perspective, dollars spent on people are dollars not spent on something else. And Canada spends a lot of dollars on people. Here's a chart with the same years and comparative nations as before, but this time focused on personnel spend. With a percentage share that is only below 45% in 1 year, 2024, Canada manages to consistently take the silver 9 years out of 10. The percentage point gap between Canada and the UK is consistently at least 10 points and occasionally more than 20, something which I'm sure resonates with any enlisted UK personnel who may be watching every time they review their paychecks, and it's only thanks to that massive green Italian bar that Canada is consistently denied the gold. But before all the Canadians in the audience start buying Ferrari shirts and happily handing the Italians their win, let me just crush that small moment of joy you might be feeling with a case of it's complicated. Because while the Italians have, in US dollar terms, a relatively similar defence budget to Canada and spend a much higher percentage of it on personnel costs, they also manage to field a lot more combat units and a lot more people using that budget. If you do a quick rough statistical exercise, over the last 5 years, as you can see on screen here, the Canadians have spent very roughly 50% of their nominal defence budget on personnel costs, while the Italians have spent the equivalent, very roughly, of 70% of a Canadian defence budget. For those same investments, Canada gets 70,000, roughly, active duty personnel, and Italy gets 171,000. 40% more spending, 140% more personnel. And before you say, hey, Perun, that's not fair, Canada is a wealthier economy with higher labour costs than Italy, sure, but it doesn't entirely solve the gap. If you use the difference in GDP per capita to adjust your figures, Italy still ends up getting more personnel per adjusted dollar invested. You can try different purchasing power parity adjustments if you want, but that won't make the comparatively high Canadian costs go away. Again, I'm not saying this is necessarily an incorrect decision. Having quality people can make or break the effectiveness of a force. And given how competitive the Canadian labour market has been at various points, it's not certain what the recruitment and retention picture would look like if that spending was significantly reduced. But given that between November 2022 and 2023, the Canadian Armed Forces reportedly received about 21,000 applications from permanent residents, only to then accept a grand total of 77 of them amidst an application process that might take between 18 and 24 months, it might be that attracting applicants in the first place isn't the be-all and end-all of the problem.
unless the intention here was to explicitly screen new potential recruits for extreme levels of patience. Reforming recruitment for permanent residents might deliver a much more significant recruitment uptick than just quadrupling down on paying conditions. Whatever the case may be, the reality is, as with everything in defence economics, this is ultimately a trade-offs problem. And if you start with a comparatively smaller budget and then spend comparatively more of it on people and other as opposed to new kit, you're inevitably going to be left with a procurement budget that's looking a bit slim and some hard choices to make. But as with many things in life, when it comes to defence procurement budgets, it's not just how big it is, it's how you use it. There are a lot of techniques various countries use to try and stretch their available resources further. They might remain hyper-focused on just the most important capabilities, shop around for the best possible deals, pick up the basic bitch options when everyone else is going for the gold plate, and keep processes as lean and efficient as possible. Or if you're Canada, you could just try and combine the military procurement equivalent of fine dining tastes and a Macca's budget. Now, it can be difficult to assess how cost-effective and efficient a procurement system is at an aggregate level. But when it comes to Canada, there are a couple of clues we could look at. For example, you could compare countries' equipment inventories with each other, adjusted for the total size of their military budgets. And while that exercise might help the Canadian picture compared to some of the comparators we looked at earlier, differences in quality and the sheer number of platform and capability types that Canada simply doesn't possess paints a pretty dismal picture as a starting point. Alternatively, you might look at what Canadian authorities have said about their own procurement system. A 2024 report by the Canadian Parliament's Standing Committee on National Defence, looking into the defence procurement system, didn't exactly paint the prettiest of pictures, including statements from witnesses asserting that the system faced bureaucratic hurdles, complexity, risk aversion, politicisation, personnel shortages in procurement, a lack of transparency and accountability, extensive delays, and cost overruns. Retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie was quoted saying the procurement process was hugely bureaucratic, slow, complicated, and that, quote, process, and more process is choking the ability to get things done, end quote. Other witnesses talked about the difficulty dealing with Canada's complex and distributed system, all the way down to the relatively simple stuff, with the CEO of Bombardier, for example, noting that in Canada, RFP documents, basically what the government puts out saying they would like to buy something, and inviting companies to send in proposals to sell them the thing or services in question, tended to compose, quote, hundreds if not thousands of pages, while similar documents in other countries were much shorter in length. We might come back to exploring the rest of that 104-page document in the future, but suffice to say it doesn't give the defence procurement system an exactly glowing review. But I think another safe way for me to bring this home is to look at just two recent examples. So let me jump in and introduce you to the Canadian Joint Support Ships. As with many Canadian procurement adventures, this arguably starts with quite a reasonable and real requirement. Even more so than some other navies and coast guards, Canadian ships need to be able to cover long distances to operate far from their bases. Think Arctic operations, for example. After all, as we established earlier, the infrastructure spend isn't exactly massive, so you have to take at least some of the infrastructure function with you. To do that, you need auxiliary ships to carry things like fuel and ammunition. So in 2004, Canada announced it was going to work towards the replacement of its two ageing Protecteur-class auxiliaries, the first of which had been commissioned in 1969. The initial thoughts were to have contracts in place by 2009 and the first ship in 2010. Then you may recall some small things happened in the global economy around 2008-2009, may have shaken things up a bit, so things start to drag more than a bit. The joint support ships make it into the National Shipbuilding Procurement Plan in 2010, and it's in 2013 when a design is finally selected. Canada takes the quote-unquote safe option of starting with an existing design, the German Berlin class, and wants to get two modified Canadian versions of the ship built in British Columbia. Note at this point we are only up to selecting a design, and the ships we are trying to replace are about 43 years old. But the delay in selecting a design is arguably the beginning of the fun, not the end here. Construction probably started around 2018, and from there it sometimes felt like the price tag and delivery timelines were in an all-out race to see who could increase by the most. Reportedly, originally the two ships were meant to cost collectively about 2.6 billion Canadian dollars. By 2024, the estimate for costs not including design, support, and a number of other factors appears to have increased to about 3.3 billion, and a 2020 estimate that was a little more inclusive was as high as 4.1 billion, about 2 billion Canadian dollars per ship. The delivery times for the two ships got pushed to 2025 and 2027 respectively, and that increase in costs doesn't really capture the opportunity cost that came along with the delay. For example, when one of those ancient replenishment ships was badly damaged in a fire in 2014, and the other later turned out to have some pretty significant problems of its own, the Canadian military desperately needed an interim replacement because the joint support ships were taking so long to arrive. That led to the ship on the right there, the MV Asterix, which was modified from a civilian vessel and then leased to the Canadian government under the terms of a 700 million Canadian dollar contract for a ship the government ultimately would not own unless they came up with more money to buy it out in the future. But okay, let's assume that next year the Canadians do get the first of these ships, over budget and behind schedule though it may be. What are they actually getting for all that money? Well, the first of the original model, the Berlins, was commissioned in 2001. 4 were built in total, 3 are in active German service at time of recording. And in terms of key characteristics, each ship displaces about 20,000 tonnes, has 4 autocannons and some man pads to serve as its defensive suite, and the onboard capacity of 9,600 cubic metres of fuel is also probably worth noting, given these things function as tankers. So using some very, very rough numbers from before, 4 billion Canadian dollars buys us 40,000 tonnes of tanker that can carry about 20,000 cubic metres of fuel. Now, I'm going to take a radical guess here and presume that most of you listening haven't recently bought a military auxiliary ship. So if you want to understand whether the numbers on the Canadian program are good or bad, we probably need a comparison. In 2012, the Brits contracted for 4 tankers for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. Reportedly, no British yard tendered for the order, so the Brits put down money with Daewoo in Korea. Approximately £600 million for 4 ships, around a quarter of which was going to be spent in the UK. At current exchange rate, £600 million is very roughly $1 billion Canadian dollars. So between a third and a quarter of the price for twice as many ships. And just in case you're wondering, hey, is the difference in price because the POM's cheaped out on the ship design itself? I can tell you there is a significant tonnage difference between the two designs, with the UK's Tide class displacing almost twice as much as the Canadian design. To go back to key characteristics, the Tide class are approximately 39,000 tonnes displacement, double-hulled. They have a flight deck capable of supporting the Chinook heavy lift helicopter and a fuel carriage capacity of about 19,000 cubic metres, again very roughly twice as much as the base Berlin class. The ships also benefited from typically Korean delivery timelines, contracts 2012, first ship laid down end of 2014, all 4 in service by the end of 2019. Obviously, no 2 ships are exactly alike or perfectly comparable. However, these are tankers, not fighter jets. They have certain basic characteristics that support a very important mission, and in this case, the difference in apparent price to outcome ratio is massive. If you take for comparison the £600 million estimate for the British ship and the $3.3 billion figure for the Canadian ships, not counting all the extras that make up that 4.1 estimate from 2020, then leaving aside shifts in inflation and the exchange rate, Canada spent very roughly 3 times as much as the UK to buy half as many ships, each with very roughly half the displacement of their British equivalent. Do the math, and that works out to Canada paying very roughly 12 times as much per tonne. Expressed another way, Canada appears to have found a way to procure 2 20,000-tonne tankers for a figure in the ballpark of what France pays for a single Barracuda-class nuclear attack submarine. And please do understand that it's often not that simple, and there's more that goes into these things than one YouTube video can possibly cover. But it's also not the only example of the Canadian procurement system metaphorically taking their Corolla budget and finding a way to pay G-Wagon prices. So let's have a look at another tale of a critical requirement, sound strategic thinking, and eye-watering spending. Given its critical strategic interest in the Arctic, it makes sense that the Canadian Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Navy would want to have ice-breaking capable patrol and warships. That seems like a pretty reasonable alternative to just building warships and having them constantly escorted by civilian icebreakers that might be vulnerable if a situation ever deteriorates. Enter a concept with plenty of equivalents across other Arctic-focused nations, the Arctic and Offshore Patrol Ships, or AOPS. In 2007, the Canadians announced they were going to purchase between 6 and 8 Polar Class 5 patrol ships, based again on an existing design. The base model was going to be the Norwegian Svalbard class, which had been in commission since late 2001 and had proven itself in service, with of course some Canadian modifications and improvements to be built in Canada. In 2010, the AOPS made it into the all-important national shipbuilding procurement strategy, but before they could be built, the Canadians needed to make their modifications and finalise their design. And I want to challenge those of you who don't know to take a guess and write it down or something, what the design cost was for what would eventually become the Canadian Harry de Wolf class. Basically, what does it cost to take an existing functional design and make it truly Canadian? Working through the numbers, Ottawa paid about $5 million for the design of the Svalbard. The Norwegians had designed and built the ship in the 2000s for less than $100 million. Also in the 2000s, Denmark would design and acquire 2 patrol ships for about $105 million, and much later on, the Irish Navy would work towards acquiring 2 ships of a different design again for about $125 million. You might think those figures, with some inflation adjustment, might provide a reasonable baseline for the Canadian program. But you see, none of them were trying to design and build their ships in Canada. And so to quote from a 2013 CBC article, Public Works Minister Rona Ambrose and Defence Minister Peter MacKay announced March 7th in Halifax that Ottawa will pay Irving Shipbuilding $288 million just to design, not build, a new fleet of Arctic offshore patrol ships. In other words, the Canadian government spent considerably more modifying the Norwegian design than the Norwegians spent designing and building their ship in the first place. Now, in full fairness, the article points out that the shipbuilding company did contest the characterisation of that $288 million Canadian dollars as purely a design contract. They described it as a definitions contract. It apparently included a range of elements beyond pure design work, and the article indicates that the government would clarify that only about 70% of the overall sum was actually for design. Again, these are not my figures, they come from the article. That would bring the 288 figure down to about 200 flat, leaving a totally reasonable cost for around $200 million to redesign a ship that had cost Norway less than that to design and build. And just like your average chapter of Slavic history, there's always room for the narrator here to say, and then it got worse. For one, reportedly a lot of that bargain design work wasn't actually done in Canada. This is relevant because there are sometimes industrial policy reasons that you might want to pay more in order to design, develop or manufacture something domestically in order to preserve and build up your capabilities and maintain your industry. What most countries are probably less likely to want to do in general is pay a domestic premium to build up some other country's industry. To again quote from the article, although Irving will manage the design project in Nova Scotia, it has subcontracted the actual production of final blueprints to a Danish firm, OMT. 70 Danish ship architects will work on those, while it also noted the role of firms like General Electric and Lockheed Martin in areas like propulsion and system integration. Reportedly, when Minister MacKay was asked why Canada would pay 10 times as much for design work as other shipyards said that work should cost, the minister reportedly replied, quote, "Other shipyards are wrong," end quote, and left it at that. Given that Arctic patrol ships are not exactly secret new or cutting-edge technology, that other countries have been able to design and field them with considerably smaller budgets, and that presumably countries like Denmark, Norway and Finland are not completely alien to the concept of ice or Arctic operations, one might suggest a fair response to that statement would be citation needed. And if what foreign shipyards had come up with missed the mark so much and were so clearly inferior to the final Canadian product, one wonders why you would pay for the right to start with the Svalbard design in the first place. And even with the design phase over, the pain for the Canadian taxpayer very much wasn't. As you can see on the right there, the Canadian government lists a total project cost of $4.98 billion Canadian dollars, excluding taxes for the 6 Navy ships, including a range of elements that you can see listed there. And of course, the Canadian Navy wasn't the only force that was going to be receiving some of these vessels. Earlier this year, it was reported the cost just for the 2 Coast Guard versions of the ship had increased from 1.6 to 2.1 billion Canadian dollars, more than 1 billion each. That's a price tag at current exchange rates of more than 700 million US dollars per vessel for a ship displacing about 6,600 tons, a crew complement in the naval version somewhere in the 60 to 70 range, and an all-up armament of 1 25mm cannon and 2 50 caliber machine guns. The ship has a missile detection system, but no missile or anti-missile armament, despite the fact that the original Svalbard design prior to modification started with a 57mm gun and the ability to mount at least a Simbad manpads. In some paper respects, the Harry Dwarfs even compare unfavourably to the most recent Russian designs. The ship on screen there, the Russian ice-breaking patrol ship Ivan Papanin, launched in 2019, is reportedly, and I think relatively credibly, a cheaper ship with a longer range and an armament consisting of 1 76mm cannon and 8 cruise missile tubes. Yes, you could argue the AOP's role was never to engage in combat against enemy surface, subsurface or aerial targets, and that those sort of duties were better left to dedicated warships, but the Russians are capable of building dedicated warships too. They just appear to have seen the sense in putting an armament even on their patrol icebreakers. And presumably when you have a country like Canada plough these sort of resources into a platform that's going to have to stay out of any medium or high-risk environment, it's always going to be an open question as to what other potential priorities might lose out, with actual warships presumably being one of the potential entries on that list. And there are enough examples here that I could probably make an entire other video on the topic. Back in the early 2000s, for example, the Canadian government decided they wanted to get this thing, the Offshore Oceanographic Science Vessel, a non-combat scientific platform intended to provide, quote, increased capability and capacity to support the marine science missions of Fisheries and Oceans Canada on our east coast. Now, yes, being able to do stuff like that is important. But originally, it was, quote, expected to cost $109 million with delivery in 2017. Go to a Canadian government website now and you will see the project budget listed at a cool $1.47 billion, with a B. Target delivery date, 2025. In cost per tonne terms, this unarmed, slow-moving science vessel is significantly more expensive than a Gerald R. Ford-class, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and so horrendously expensive that a country would need a massive military budget by global standards specifically focused on procurement to get away with paying these kinds of total project costs while still being internationally competitive in terms of platform count, modernity, and overall military capability. And ultimately, that's the kind of budget that Canada just doesn't have. But as we get towards the end today, I want to zoom out for some bigger picture observations and reflections. And I actually want to start by quoting directly from a Canadian government document that I think summarises relatively well some of the challenges their military is now facing. Quote, after decades of neglect, there is indeed a significant commitment capability gap. Even if the Canadian forces were fully manned and had modern state-of-the-art equipment, to fulfil existing defence commitments would be a daunting challenge. The truth, however, is that much of the equipment of most elements of the Canadian forces is in an advanced state of obsolescence or is already obsolete. Modernisation programs have not kept pace with obsolescence. The document then goes on to suggest that the maritime forces have too few operational vessels, very limited capacity to operate in the Arctic, and that the land forces have severe equipment shortages and too few combat-ready soldiers. As for the Air Force, it laments things including the lack of replacements for lost CF-18s and the gap in terms of logistics, medical and transport capabilities. As for why all that's the case, it nominates the following, quote, the root of the problem is the level of funding available to defence over the last 25 years. There has been a long-term trend towards spending smaller percentages of the federal budget and of Canada's gross domestic product on defence. In some of those 25 years, defence spending actually fell. In many others, it did not keep pace with inflation. Inevitably, the portion of the defence budget that suffered the most from this neglect was that used to buy new equipment. The document noted that NATO countries were spending, on average, 25% of their defence budgets on equipment acquisition, while in some years, the Canadian figure got as low as 9%. Essentially, the document suggests the Canadian Armed Forces didn't get this way overnight, it took a quarter century of underinvestment. And here's the kicker. That wasn't the 2024 Canadian Defence Strategy I was quoting, it was the one from 1987. If, according to the Canadian government, the armed forces were dealing with 25 years of underinvestment in the 1980s, by this point, it's beyond 60. And that's the kind of procurement and modernisation backlog that can be very difficult to dig yourself out of. So observation one is that the problems here are very old, and the hole is very, very deep. Observation two is that procurement strategy is rarely black and white, it's full of trade-offs and complexities. There are often some very compelling strategic reasons, including industrial policy, to go with a domestic producer of military equipment, for example, even if that ends up being more expensive than a foreign competitor. There might be reasons to have several small, short-run productions of certain military equipment or munitions, so that policymakers don't find themselves locked into a particular decision and are free to change their mind and priorities on a year-by-year basis. And of course, from a military perspective, everyone loves getting highly customised equipment that is specifically tailored to their particular training and operational needs and has the absolute top-tier level of capability. The problem is, while all of those things can be nice to haves, they all else being equal, tend to come with costs in one way or another. So while you might want Gucci gear or to support your domestic manufacturers, what you probably can't afford to do is buy small, short and uncertain production runs of top-tier, highly customised equipment manufactured only at home, using a small fraction of an already small budget. On paper, that sounds like a pretty textbook case of trying to have champagne tastes on a definitively beer budget. And the longer you take that approach, the deeper you dig the hole, the more time and money it's likely to take to get yourself back to where you want to be.
One of the great blessings of Canada's strategic geography is that to a great extent it's had the luxury of being complacent. When faced with potential strategic threats and imperatives, it's always going to be tempting, rather than putting up billions of dollars, to have every war game consist of the senior Canadian officer present speed dialing Washington DC, and then have Uncle Sam come in off the sidelines with the chair and beat the shit out of whoever the Red Force happens to be that week. One objection to that approach, though, is that while the costs of self-reliance often tend to be financial and obvious, those of external reliance are often a tad more subtle. To a great extent, I'd argue the United States often functions as a security exporter, not a security donor. And while countries may not always pay directly for the kind of protection the US and other allied forces can offer, it's a point of leverage and dependence that can potentially shape state interactions on a whole range of other issues, from trade to foreign affairs. And if you read into the Canadian government's own stated strategic logic and imperatives, to a great extent the country's strategic interests, international influence, and clout within its own alliance structures depends on what it militarily can do itself and what it can bring to the alliance table. The logic was officially acknowledged during the Cold War, and it continues to appear in Canadian documents now. Unless the US ever has a change of heart about potentially adding some new northern states, Canada can probably get away with not fixing the Canadian Armed Forces. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be enormous strategic benefits to doing so. And if Ottawa decides they are serious about fixing the situation, there's probably no way around something you wouldn't ordinarily want to do, trying to fix multiple problems at once. The issues across the board are arguably so multifaceted, so deep-seated, so long-running, that you may not be able to afford to patch just one issue at a time. You could increase the Canadian defence budget to 2% of Canadian GDP, but if an insufficient share is dedicated to new equipment and maintenance, you're not going to dig your way out of the hole. If you allocate the budget but still end up paying Ferrari standard prices for Ford standard products, you're not going to get out of the hole. And if you don't fix the recruitment process so you have enough of the right people staffing the military to maintain and leverage all of the new equipment you're acquiring, once again, you're probably not going to dig yourself out of the hole. There's a huge amount more that could probably be said here, from more examples of procurement going wrong to a study of what exactly is wrong, how it got to be wrong, and how it might be fixed. But this episode's already pretty long, and I'd like to be able to work in Canada ever again. So unless this video gets a sequel, I do want to close out on a positive note. At a fundamental level, Canada is a country with significant military and economic potential. It has some advanced industry, highly skilled employees, a storied military history, robust alliance structures, strong international relations, immense resources, the capacity for research and development, and perhaps most importantly in all this, a military that historically has been full of some very talented, motivated, well-trained and capable people, with an extensive record of often getting the job done, despite not having half the tools they need and half the tools they do have being out of service. If policymakers choose to do so and the execution is there, there's no reason to think that Canada couldn't get back to a situation where it's punching above its weight and above its budget in global affairs, where its Arctic security picture is considerably better and more self-reliant, its contributions to its alliance structures and allied deterrence grows along with its influence in those organisations, and the Canadian military is much better positioned to be a tool of national policy and national values wherever they're needed, be that in peacekeeping, disaster relief, training allied forces, or defending and deterring against threats to Canada and its people. The plus side of starting from this sort of low baseline is there's a lot of upward potential there, but the path to getting there probably doesn't involve buying $2 billion tankers. And okay, channel update time. We'll keep it efficient, as this was definitely a long one. Firstly, ever since I covered the Bundeswehr and its procurement picture back in 2022, I've always known for fairness' sake that a follow-up on Canada would have to be coming, so here it finally is today. I tried to cover a lot of ground, but out of necessity had to leave some paths untrod, so depending on the reception, this may not be the end of the Canadian story on the channel. In terms of other updates, patrons, thank you for voting on the poll regarding the CADEX materials. The first of the extra items should start going up this coming week. And to Peruvian gaming fans, we're getting close to the end of the X4 series, so I've started planning what comes next, including a potential return to Terra Invicta, but I'll make sure to keep you updated. As always, thank you very much to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement with the channel. I very much hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I hope to see you all again next week.